So, as we get ready to talk about Acts 2, 8 through 11, let's hit some of the background again. So, Acts 2 is a pretty important chapter. This is Simon Peter's first sermon that is recorded in the book of Acts, and of course, it's a very stylized type of writing. It's Luke has fashioned this, much as he fashioned the speeches of Jesus in the book of Luke, in a highly literary style that allows the readers to understand what is being said from an attractive way. It makes it easy to read, easy to listen to. So going back to Luke, at the end of the book of Luke, of course, you have the death and resurrection of Jesus. And there, at the end of Luke, in chapter 24, there is this mention of the promise of the Father. That becomes important in Acts chapter 1. Again, Acts is the second part of this Luke-Acts bookended piece. One focuses on the works of Jesus, one focuses on the disciples continuing the works of Jesus. That's the second book, obviously, that's Acts. So what happens in chapter 1 that sets up chapter 2? Well, chapter 1 begins with Jesus' ascension. It picks up exactly from where Luke 24 left off, which is the death and resurrection of Jesus and the anticipation of the future and the need to be there in Jerusalem, hanging out, waiting for what would come next. So Jesus' ascension kicks us off in Acts chapter 1. Then, as Jesus goes up, the disciples are looking up, and I should say at this point, these are the pre-apostles. They're by the disciples, I mean I know I've said earlier that Luke's word for Christian is disciple, but I'm talking here, I should say, again, about the apostles. So the 11, there was Judas, who betrayed Jesus, killed himself, and then there are the 11 that are left, and they're gazing into heaven, and all of a sudden they see these two angels, right? And the angels say, why do you stand gazing here into heaven? This same Jesus is going to come again. Now Jesus has told them right before he ascended, has reiterated the words from Luke chapter 24 to wait here for the promise of the Father. So they're told to wait. As Jesus ascends and they begin the waiting process, these angels say Jesus is going to come again, and this gives birth to a whole lot of Christian thinking about what the end involves. It's interesting how religions in general, not just Christianity, certainly not just Judaism or Islam, but religions in general seem to be interested in both the beginnings and the ends, right? The beginnings of life, the end of life, the beginning of creation, the end of creation. Well, Christianity is no different. And so with this anticipation of the future, Jesus has come, he's gone back to heaven, and then there are these announcements that he's going to come again. And what Christian thinkers have done throughout the centuries with that is called eschatology. It comes from the combination of two Greek words, eschaton, meaning last, and logos, meaning word, matter, or thing. So typically when we talk about eschatology, if you've heard that word before, we're talking about the last things. And so part of the last things is the return of Jesus. Now, we're not going to talk about eschatology. We could, but we're not going to. What we are saying is simply that there is this anticipation that's built into the fabric of Acts chapter 1 that something else is coming about. Something else is afoot. Jesus is going to return. But again, they are to abide in Jerusalem until the promise of the Father. Now, what is that? The promise of the Father is the Spirit. And if you read intently through the book of Luke, you will see that there is, again, this hopefulness, this anticipation that the Spirit will be poured out. Well, in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, the writer says, speaking for Jesus, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. And this is Jesus' last words before he is taken up, before he ascends. So the 11 know to wait there. Now after that, what happens is they choose lots, they throw lots in a kind of drawing who would take Judas's place, and that's a guy named Matthias. But they are intent on waiting there in Jerusalem for this unknown promise of the Father. And while it's known that it's the Spirit, what that would mean, how that plays out, boy, that's big time stuff. That's not something that they're necessarily used to, because in the Old Testament, those upon whom the Spirit comes to rest they're a select few. There are a few prophets. There are judges, Moses, Joshua, David, and again, just a few prophets. But there is something that begins to develop in the Old Testament, this anticipation that the Spirit will be poured out on everyone. Now, that's particularly the kind of language that you get from the Old Testament prophet Joel. And what's going to be important about that is that Simon Peter quotes Joel in his sermon in Acts chapter 2. So then at the beginning of Acts chapter 2, they're waiting there. We're told there are 120 of them. There is conversation about whether all 120 are in the upper room or if it's just the 12. Kind of could be read a couple of different ways, but the Spirit comes to rest. There's a rushing mighty wind, tongues of fire appearing above their heads. It's a miraculous kind of event, and people begin to speak in unknown languages, and others hear and are able to understand. One of the things that happens here in Acts chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, as Simon Peter quotes Joel, there is an anticipation that all people, young, old, male, female, bond, free, all people could experience the Spirit. That is fundamentally different than that Old Testament paradigm, wherein only a select few, particularly those that are given to charismatic leadership, experience the Spirit. So we'll pick up now with Acts chapter 2, verses 8 to 11 in the next session.